Today I want to talk about API-based client-server applications with test-driven development and ActiveResource. So, in traditional Rails applications, we have an application in blue, and it has a database connection of some sort, typically, and the layer that communicates to the database is ActiveRecord. It's the ORM layer, the object relational mapping layer, and the language that ActiveRecord talks with the database is SQL, typically. That's great. It works really well. And it's a very common model of data persistence and data retrieval through databases. I'm sure many of you have built applications that are doing this. Yes? Yes, pretty much everybody, right? Perfect. I have to. This is fun. There's another model. It's that model where you have a client application, that talks to another server. And it talks over some protocol that could be, in this case, JSON. And if both applications are Rails applications, then you can have an ActiveResource layer here. So this is taking the place of what ActiveRecord would do if you talk to a database. ActiveResource makes your data connections look just like a database model. Let's talk more about this in a second. And the other side has what's called an API here. Typically, APIs are, controllers with actions on them. And if the API is done in a particularly well-managed way, namely if it's RESTful, that is the magic keyword here, then the mapping between the API and between that ActiveResource object can be pretty seamless, because RESTful APIs are designed to support the four CRUD operations in their own way. The CRUD operations are the database operations, namely create, read, update, and delete, that we do in SQL with the SQL statements. If the API is developed in a RESTful way, then it supports that as well through the HTTP verbs, and you know what they are: get, put, post, and delete. And ActiveResource was added to Rails around 2.0 or so. And it's designed to, make the data connection to the backend somewhat transparent. And I'm saying somewhat because it's not fully there. And then the server application, of course, might have its own database it talks to through SQL again. This is a common model. We already know this. We have client applications all over. We have perhaps JavaScript on our front end. We have maybe Flash. We have maybe mobile things. This is not an uncommon model that we see in the industry. And now the question is, between this model here and between this other model, the SQL model, and I'm all over the map here. Okay, the SQL model and the API-based model, which one is better? Or what are the trade-offs? The trade-offs are, in my opinion, are these, but I'm interested to hear your opinion on it. The database-backed one is fast. An ActiveRecord is extremely well developed. It is a super well fleshed out ORM layer that does a lot of stuff really, really fluidly and intuitively and easily. Complex relationships are easily possible. Complex relationships are the hallmark of relational databases. They do it well through join tables and indices and stuff like that. And ActiveRecord maps it really well. The problem is, though, your front ends are somewhat tightly coupled to the back end. So that might limit the number of clients you can develop. Typically, you have just a direct layer on top of the ActiveRecord model. You have your controller layer. It's difficult to put other layers on top of that without, some intervening steps. Now, the API-backed ones have that advantage. They're looser coupled. They're actually a separate application altogether. And the API is a public interface. The downsides are you have an additional server in the middle between your data and your consumer. There's more latency, and the other downside is that complex relationships are not so easy, despite some attempts to make that easier. Now, one of the big advantages is the last bit here. It scales well to multiple front ends, so you can have a situation that looks like this, where you have a common server with a common API and a database that talks to multiple different front ends. And these could now be all sorts of different things. They could be other web applications. They could be client applications, Flash or JavaScript, or they could be mobile applications. If you have a common API, all these are possible out of the box without much trouble. This is not possible with the database model. And Tim O'Reilly calls this the, what does he call it? The operating system of the internet, where APIs are the common language that everybody speaks, and the better you know what the APIs are out there, the easier your life is going to be as application developer. So if we can understand how to use APIs effectively and build APIs effectively, we can participate in that larger game out there. Some companies don't have an option. Like the particular client we're working with right now has this need that they need a common server that administers multiple front ends. So the administration side is shared, and they don't want to limit themselves to just one front end. They want to have the ability to scale front ends, perhaps even make that a pay service, so that they could just publish the API and charge for it. It's a common business model which we want to support. Now, how does Rails do this? And I mentioned ActiveResource already. I'm curious if you're familiar with it. Who has played with ActiveResource? 2 people. 3 maybe. Okay. Who has played with ActiveRecord? Everybody. Right. Okay. So it's a must. I think the showing of the hands here is representative for the popularity of this plugin, or this component of Rails, I should say, and it's also representative for the quality of it. There's a few gotchas here, and we will see a couple of them. So ActiveResource, the basic concept or the basic promise is that ActiveResource models kind of look like models from ActiveRecord. And in Rails 3, this is even going a step further with this active model concept. They map the CRUD operation. So you can do, a model.create or .save or .destroy. Those all map, and then they call the corresponding controllers on your RESTful actions. And we'll see that in a little demo in a little bit. It does not support any associations out of the box. And it also doesn't do validations out of the box, although Rails 3 is adding some of that. And generally, ActiveResource is a lot rougher on the edges than ActiveRecord. And when we started developing this, we ran into a number of gotchas, perhaps due to my own ignorance about it. But it also felt that there wasn't as much development done on them. And what I want to do in this talk is I don't want to just stand here and present slides. I want to actually do something with you guys, just like the last time I was here. And we're going to have a little back and forth, interactive kind of group sharing, pairing session or something. And what I'm looking for is feedback. Perhaps you have some insights that we haven't had, and tips, of how to make this better. And I mentioned in the beginning of my talk TDD, and we're going to get to that. ActiveResource is just like ActiveRecord, a class, a base class, and you can instantiate a model by deriving from it, and then you specify, which is different here. My mouse, okay. You specify the data source. In ActiveRecord, you would have a database.yml file that tells you what database to go to and what server and what username and so on. Here, you do a URL because we're talking to another server, right? And then you can specify format also. The default format is XML, and it hasn't been updated, which shows you something about the popularity or freshness of this component. JSON is somewhat supported, and we made it work. And JSON is the more recent or the more current way of doing APIs, and so we wanted to use that. But once you got that, you can pretty much say person.create, and you give it a name if that person has a name attribute on the server side. And then it would actually make a post to /people URL, and it gives this in the payload, the attribute list. And you can do a person.find also, and then it makes a GET request against that people URL with the RESTful URL style, where the IDs show up on the URL components. The question is there still ActiveRecord? If you have control over both the client and the server code, which sometimes you do not, and then you have to deal with the server as it is. But if you have control over both, then we can do more things that we could without. And in this particular example, we do have ActiveRecord on the server side. So the comment was, the comment is about shallow versus deep APIs. Basically, it does each resource have its own set of controller actions, and does each resource map to a controller like a person or an address or a company or any entity in the database that might typically be a table in the database could map to a set of controller actions and the controller and URLs. And that's a great question or great comment, because I want to go over the RESTful routes a little bit that are resource-based in Rails. I have another comment on this, and in fact, last year I spoke here. I said something about deep APIs versus shallow APIs. Shallow APIs are APIs where each table in the database or each entity has its own set of URLs, and you can manipulate it, at atomic level. You can create it, you can update it, you can delete it. Deep APIs are a narrow set of URLs, sometimes quite customized, that control a complex nested data structure. And what you want to do depends on your application. If you go and use or overuse the scaffold generator, you end up with very shallow APIs because it makes one for each resource. And that might be all right, and this is what we're going to do for the demo here. Generally, in production applications, this is not what you want because you end up with lots of security problems and all sorts of holes out there, and data integrity becomes a huge nightmare. And generally, you want to control very well the data structures you pass in and out of the API, and be very sure about who is allowed to do what. And generally, fewer access points into the controllers tend to be more solid, or tend to lead to more solid applications. It's a trade-off generally between complexity of the data structure and atomicity of the manipulations of operations. I want to briefly break out into resourceful routes. Declare map.resource at the top there in Rails in the routes file. Then you get seven automatic URLs. You get the /people URL, which goes to the index action with the get request. That same URL ends up going to the create action with the post requests. The verb toggles the different action here. You get the new route, which typically displays a form for adding a new object. You get the edit route, which is for editing something that already exists because it contains an ID. You get the show route, which also is for something that exists. You get the put action, the put verb on that same route, which updates something that exists, and you get the delete route. Those are the 7 RESTful routes. Is this familiar, or is it not familiar? So when I said earlier that ActiveResource maps an object, kind of like ActiveRecord does to CRUD, this is the background requirement. It needs to have a controller that talks to these routes, and then it's out of the box. If you don't have, so if you generate the server in Rails and you use these types of resource-based routes, then you are okay. If you use some sort of commercial server that doesn't know what REST is, or they only pay lip service to it, then typically ActiveResource does not get you very far. And like the Google API uses a completely different model. The Google API uses Atom feeds, which is miles apart from this. And I haven't seen anybody who successfully mapped Google APIs to ActiveResource, which is a bummer. Could be easier to use if it were that way. So, as I mentioned earlier, there is a lacking support for associations and also validations in ActiveResource in Rails 2.3. That has not inhibited people from adding that through plugins. There's something called HyperactiveResource, which adds associations. And we were skeptical at first, but it does that reasonably well. So you can declare a has-many association on an ActiveResource class, and that has-many the association can be with another ActiveResource entity or with an ActiveRecord entity. So you can mix and match them, which seems to be quite powerful. And if you have a client-server application where the server, has some data and the client references it by ID, then you are able to make other associations with that same ID on the client side, and that could lead to quite powerful applications. And that said, it's a bit rough around the edges, so your mileage may vary. The other thing, it does support nested routes, which ActiveResource does not out of the box. So if you have, a person has many cars or something, then if that kind of relationship exists, then you might map the person, / cars on or addresses in this case here. You might map that in nested routes because each person needs to be there before the address can be there, kind of thing. That also is supported, and it maps that to a has-many model. Unfortunately, HyperactiveResource cannot mix nested routes with non-nested routes. If you have a one-off exception, then you're hosed. It does also add validations. We played with this. It seems to be solid. I want to mention this if you guys want to play with this, but I don't want to go into it further. And instead, I want to do some coding. Right. So I want to show you how a RESTful API can be made for JSON, and I also want to show you how we can make a HyperactiveResource-based. Actually, I'm just going to use an ActiveResource-based plugin for now. So I'm making a new Rails app, which I'm going to call for the occasion, the Bay Ruby Meetup server. And it made some files now here. So I have the EBR server, and that contains my standard Rails stack. Now, next I want to be able to, have a person in there. Like I want to create a person database object, and I want to have an API for it using JSON. So next thing I need to do is clear all this. I would script generate RSpec to have RSpec support. And then I'm going to script generate RSpec scaffold with my person object. And I'm going to give this person object, a person model rather, a first name of string type and the last name of string type. Is this familiar? Scaffold generator? Okay. So what's this do? This created a lot of stuff now. And at this point, the time has come to switch to a proper editor. Let's see here. Which in my case will be RubyMine as well. Okay, so here it is. Whoa. Okay. All right, so I want to call that I already had that name, Bay Ruby Meetup server, and it should be in that folder. And it already found the existing Rails application. Can connect right to it. Okay. All right. So the first thing, if you use if you use RSpec scaffold generator before, I don't like it that much because it creates a lot of stuff that I don't want in the end. It's back to this idea of shallow APIs. You have all the stuff in here, including at the very bottom in the footnotes, you have destroy, which if you don't block this, it'll actually leave your server wide open for destroying objects. Generally not a good idea. Also, I want JSON. So this thing comes with XML built in. I'm going to just turn this over to JSON now. So I'm going to replace the text XML with JSON. And we do it everywhere. Let's just double check that we're actually in a good spot here. Yes, yes. So down here, you guys know this respond to format block? What this means is the controller can actually handle both types of requests. It can handle a standard, text HTML request or an application JSON request. And depending on the accept header that comes in or the format that is tagged onto the parameters, it'll render either way. And then in the JSON case, this is really clever. You can just say render JSON people, and this people variable is an array of, persons coming from here, database query. And it will automatically serialize this to JSON, which is overridable also, what it does doing there. So I'm going through here, replacing every single XML thing with JSON. Great. Okay. Now, it also makes controller tests. It makes a whole bunch of tests. I'm a big fan of TDD. In this case, I'm not going to get stuck on this one because time is limited. And I want to get to the guts of this. Namely, I want to show you TDD with the ActiveResource-based client part. So we can deal with this here. These controller tests, in my opinion, are bad. This is not good because they use mocks everywhere. And mocks have a place, but this is the wrong place, in my opinion. So just a footnote. For now, we have a controller that can serve JSON and HTML. And we have a migration also. Should be able to run that migration. Let's do that in RubyMine. And now I should have a server that can run. Let's run that server. Port 3000 by default. And now I should be able to see that in a web browser. So here's my web browser. And here's my port 3000. And since I have support for both HTML and JSON, I can go to the index action here and I can add a new person, and it comes out of the box with the 2 fields. This is familiar, right? More or less? Okay, good. No rocket science here. Now the interesting bit, let's talk about JSON a bit. So how can I actually test the server, in JSON? So I could write an RSpec, against it to make sure that if I say dot format, is JSON, then I get that back. But at this point, I'm feeling not quite confident with the technology yet. And when I don't feel confident with the technology, it's too soon to write a test in my book. I get stuck writing the test. What I want to do is I want to experiment with the technology. And what comes to mind is the console, script console in Rails, or in this case, I can just use the command line for the server. So I'm at the server here. Now I can use the curl command. Let's clear this. So curl is a way to, talk to a URL. So I can just say http://localhost 3000 people.json. And now I get back a JSON array. JSON, if you don't know what it is exactly, it is basically a hash. Initially we get, this is the first hash key here. So there's an array because I'm talking to multiple people. I'm getting the index list of all people. And then this is a key, colon, and then the value. And the value goes all the way to here. And that's one record in the database. JSON is the JavaScript object representation. Basically, JavaScript objects are represented just like that. And a hash in JavaScript is an object, and an object is also a hash. This is why JSON is such a powerful format, much, much, much better than XML. And this is why I like it. So, I have other URLs I could use here. Don't know what happened here. Okay. Curl. Nope. Where's my curl? Okay. Grab this. I can go to people/1.json. That is the first record. Now, you see in here there's one odd thing. It actually prefixes this with person. It's the first key, and then it has the attributes, created at and ID and last name. So that's a bit of an oddity, which actually is one of the things that is rough around the edges with ActiveResource. What we would like is to not have that, because the consumer, the ActiveResource consumer layer, doesn't expect this. Yet by default it's turned on. So we can turn that off. Actually, before I do that, I want to talk to you about the other part of the equation, namely the other application, the client application. So let's make the client application. Let's make the Rails app also. And now I just want, this one doesn't have anything in it. It doesn't have a controller. It's going to have a single model, which is ActiveResource based, and I want to also use RubyMine for that. Let's see here. New project. Can I? See, this is why I'm giving these talks, because I learned so much. And now I have to navigate to it. Okay, let me type it in. East Bay Ruby client. It does remember the previous path though. Okay, so this is my other application, and I have nothing in here. It's pretty clean. And I want to make a new model. Let's call that the person model. And this one is going to be class person, active, make that a little bigger, ActiveResource base. So as I said earlier, we need to set the site, or rather self.site. And the site should be, in this case, http://localhost 3000. And it already knows by itself that it needs to go to the /people URL. And then I want to set the format. Default is XML, but I like JSON. So that should, oh, it needs to have an equal sign here. Thanks to Ruby. I'm sorry? I think it's redundant, yeah. And so now I want to experiment with the technology a little bit. So let's just go to script console and see if I can talk to the server. Person.find all. So I get something back here. So that came from the server now. And let's see, RubyMine server. So here's the server log. It got, an index. See that? No, my scroll bar is missing the last bit here. Okay, great. Yeah, it got an index request from JSON, and that just came from the console client. So I got that. Now what if I get the first person dot find one, then we have a problem. And the problem here is what I mentioned earlier. So do you guys see what I did? I got the first person. It does claim to have some sort of person attribute. In fact, Smith and Joe is here, but I cannot get the first name. And the reason for this is this this additional key in the JSON object that it doesn't expect. So, which is bizarre. I don't know why this hasn't gotten fixed in Rails yet. I don't think for XML this happens, but for JSON, the server sticks in this additional key up here, this one, and the client doesn't expect that with all default values. This is very un-Rails. Usually the defaults are great defaults. They work out of the box, but in this case they don't. So, several hours later, yeah, there's another thing actually I want to show you, which is helpful if you are doing this debugging thing. You can set up a logger. So in here, in my shell, I can set up the ActiveResource. Can you guys see that? A little higher. The ActiveResource base logger. I'm going to reassign, and I'm going to actually clone the ActiveRecord base logger for it. And now I have a logger entity here. Every time I make a request, it now tells me, oops, this one is not the request I meant. Every time I make a request, it now should tell me what it's doing, but it's not. Let's see, I need to probably restart this guy here and start that right at the beginning. Oh. Also, the person.all doesn't exist, which is annoying. So you have to say person.findAll, which is the old style ActiveRecord way of doing it. And we still don't get the logger. Okay. Oh, that was nonsense. I meant to say logger.new std out. Okay, now I have a logger that's print stuff on the screen. And now I get what I wanted to get. Now I get here the actual request that is made against the server. So far, so good. So the problem that we're having right now is the server generates the additional person key for the JSON hash, which I don't want. So how to turn this off? It has the problem, find all, so that if I get the first object back here, And then that's still that person, and if I say first person, it has the same problem. First name. Yeah, it wants to have first.person, right? Yeah. But that's stupid. I mean, I don't. So yeah, we figured this out too. Eventually, this came to us. Okay, so we need to first fix this. How are we going to fix this? There is some obscure field in. Of course, it's not simple. Let's see. We are on the server. Okay. So under config, there's this initializers directory, and there's something called new Rails initializers, new Rails defaults. That has an ominous name all by itself. And if you venture into these depths, then you might find there is something called ActiveRecord base include root in JSON. So we tried this now. And let's restart this guy. So hopefully now I can get some person here. Let's just get the first guy. Or let's get Joe. Person.find1. And Joe.firstName now works magically. Okay. So we got that, right? Okay, so there's the similar problem that now, of course, I could create a person here, right? So I have a RESTful controller. I should be able to create stuff also. So what if I say person.create first name last name solo. This looks good on paper. It says 201 created. Let's see what the server says. Server actually got insert people into people, last name, values, null, null, right? So it pretends to actually do it, but unless you look at the very edge of the screen, then it doesn't actually do it, which is kind of frustrating. You know, you find this out, and then here. So as it turns out, the server, conversely, the server, if you look at this more carefully, the server code does expect params of person. So the server code does expect that first key of the incoming JSON hash. Right? So, but for some reason, the client defaults to not send it. So, oops, right. So here, now I'm in the client application. Certainly there is the same config directory with new Rails defaults, and it turns out, even though it's not documented, there is a similar ActiveResource base include root in JSON. So, ActiveResource base include JSON, which by default turns out to be false, but I want it to be true in this case. So they're actually the opposite of what they're supposed to be. Now, with that in mind, let me restart the shell. And let me try if I can create a person now. I cannot see the right side of the screen very well. You have to tell me if I make typos. Did you guys see the 30-year Star Wars rerun? I saw it. Okay, so it said something here. We saw something slide by on the server. We got another insert statement. And this time, sure enough, actually it did make it into the database. So now we have actually a client-server hookup that sort of works. So we have a way to talk to the server from the client and both read and create objects, what I'm going to say. So now what I'd like to do, me being the TDD guy, I would like to write a test against this. I would like to write a test that I can actually create something and that it sticks in the database, but the database is now remote. So, like, I'd like to verify it somehow. And typically, if you don't have control over the API, what people typically do is they mock things. So what I like to do is, I would like to, in my standard Rails application with ActiveRecord against the database, I have RSpec model tests with fixtures and factories and a lot of support for it. And then I have a test database that is there just for tests, and they have transaction support. That means I get a clean state of the database for every single test case, and it rolls back at the end. I get a really nice setup, which is really intuitive and easy to use, and This is why TDD has taken off like wildfire in Rails. It is just intuitive and easy to use. But if I live in this other world, okay, quick repeat, if I'm in ActiveRecord, I can do a person create, I can do a lambda, should change, person count. This stuff is, or I could check the destroy. This stuff is something I would like to do, but I now have this set up here. I have a JSON layer, and the database is far away. And my RSpec model tests live way up here, and that test database is on a whole different server. This is not even running. So what can I do? Like, is there a way to do this? What I would like to do is something like this. I would like to have some sort of way to say, okay, well, I'm going to pretend that, there is some sort of remote server here, like through fake web. Fake web is a way to pretend that some URL exists. And it's a GitHub gem. It's a great gem. And what you can do is you can register some URI, and you can say, you can specify the response. So if the test code goes against this URI, then it should return this test response. In my case, this is not really helpful because the test response, this hello world thing, is now needing to be a mock object. I need to pretend something comes back from the server. This is the okay and best way to do it if you don't have control over the server. If you're talking to other services like Facebook or Google or someone else out there, then you can TDD your application with a mock. And chances are that the API won't change, every day. And maybe it does in Facebook. But you at least get some stability, hopefully, on a popular service, that you don't have to keep revving your mocks. The trouble is, if you are doing client development and server development at the same time, then your mocks have to be in sync with the server code. And what happens if the server code goes out of sync? So what are the problems with mocks? Server code can get out of sync with the client code, and then we have that same problem. We have bugs, because now we're pretending to talk to some mock object that emulates a different server response than the server actually does, which is the reason I don't like mocks, except in very narrow cases. It ends up being a non-dry problem. You have to maintain two different pieces of code. And so we looked at this, and we saw this is a real liability in our ongoing development, because we're developing this application for this client company, and we're doing both the server and the client at the same time, and everything is revving at the same time. We didn't want the overhead of having to maintain the mock layer separately. So instead, beyond mocks, we thought, what can we do to come up with this? And we come up with this concept of remote specs. We'd like to make sure there is a remote server running in test environment, and we would like to have some sort of mechanism to set up some test data on the remote server. Then we want to inspect that certain things happen that didn't happen to the test data on the remote server, and then we want to tear it down again. That's the premise, using the tools that we have. So the way this is going to look in the end is we need some sort of way to communicate some background behind the scenes data between the server and the client. And one technology that we looked at is DRB. And DRB works like this. DRB is another client-server architecture, really. It comes with Ruby. It stands for Distributed Ruby. And it's a cool tool because it lets you set up a little client object that talks to some proprietary DRB protocol to a little server object. And it is trying to simulate remote method invocations. So on my client, I can call a method on the DRB object, and it looks like as if it ran in the server and returned the results back to me. So we looked at this, and we thought, can we use this to set up some test data? Can we use this for factories, for example, to set up like a factory object on the remote server? And can we use it to run a find against the remote server to check some, database record is there or not? And can we use it perhaps for other things? And so we looked at this, and we wanted to investigate a little bit, what's there for us. And what I'd like to show is how we put these pieces together. Who is familiar with DRB? Has played with it? A couple of people? All right. So let's do a simple little test in DRB, and then we're going to put it all together. Let's look at this. So I'm in, doesn't really matter where I'm at. I'm just going to pretend I'm in a IRB shell. and I'm going to require a DRB. And I have another process which is also an IRB shell, and I'm also going to require a DRB. And now from the server, I can set up some DRB stuff. I can, I want to have an object, for example, a string, that I want to have methods called on from the remote side. Now, how can I, make that available? And DRB makes this pretty simple. You can say DRB start service, DRuby, that's the protocol, localhost, and then you give it some port. It doesn't matter really. 9000 tends to be used a lot for this. And now I have some sort of server running there, which prints out some stuff. So now this server is listening on port 9000 for remote method invocations. Now on my client, this is the other process here. I can now try to connect to this. So I can try to connect to my remote string. Using bObject.new, and I give it the port. Now I have this DRB object. Now this object will be able to pass methods through the server and return the result. So it's a string now. I could do things like upcase. Whoa. No, what's nil? I started the service and I did not give it anything. In fact, I gave it nil. Okay, let's kill this one and do it again. Thank you. Require DRB. Okay, I want to make a string object. And I want to say, okay, now proxy the string object through the remote. DRB start service. DRuby localhost 9000, comma, str. Okay, now that's the thing being proxied. So let's see, the remote string. Let's reconnect this one. And now the remote string, so if I say puts remote string, I get the object. Okay, so this is coming from the server. Now I can also call, actually this already called a method. This called the 2s method on it. I can also call other things. I can call upcase. Now that upcased it here, but the upcase bang method also typically modifies the object. So theoretically, that should also now be in the server, be modified. So let's see here what my string looks like. It's now also upcased. Does it make sense? So I'm on the client here, and I'm talking to a server object, and I can modify that too. It's proxied through. That's a pretty cool mechanism. We saw that, and we thought, well, maybe this should be useful for something. And what we ended up trying to do is to use this mechanism as a back-channel communication between our test infrastructure on the client that uses ActiveResource to do some setup stuff, and some query stuff and some teardown stuff on that remote server, so that we can live in our RSpec world and pretend everything is nice, and the DRB process takes care of the rest behind the scenes. There's a couple other gotchas here you have to be careful with, though. For example, now if I change the object on the server, now I can downcase this again. Now then the client has a downcase as well. If I do something like str plus equals ... now on the client, it doesn't have the ... What happened? Any guess? This actually will change the object. This will clone, make a copy. This is plus equals. And so you end up with a copy, and I now throw away the handle to the initial thing. I have no way to get that back. And my server is now serving that old object, which I don't have access to anymore in the current environment. So I lost it. So there's a few gotchas like that. The documentation page on this, if you go to the Google Ruby API docs. This stuff pops up on the first page, and it's pretty intuitive. I was amazed that it's so simple. And I always was afraid there's more to it than meets the eye, and I'm still afraid that there is, and this is why I'm here talking about it. So I hope you guys can tell me if there's something that's missing. So let's continue on in the interest of time. Okay, so in my client application, here we are. I want to be able to write a spec for this person object. And let's see. I haven't done any RSpec stuff here. Okay, let's start that. Start that from scratch. And this is the server, and this is the client. Okay, now I got some client stuff here. Spec directory, and there's not much in there yet because it's brand new. So let's make a model directory. And inside of it, I want to make a person spec.rb. So, and I would ideally like to say something like, it retrieves a remote person. And what I'd like to write is something kind of like, in pseudocode, kind of like this. Person.find, or p equals person.find, some sort of remote object that I would like to set up beforehand, kind of, .id. So I want to before step in here, I don't know, like remote person equals some sort of factory thing, remote something rather, kind of. I'd like to have some mechanism to instantiate something on the other side. You guys have heard about factories, right? So if this was a regular factory, I could just say, okay, person would be factory person. And that makes it in my local test database. But I don't have a local test database because I'm talking over API service. So I need to do something like this. Let's get to that. That's the goal. I want to be able to say, find this, okay. Now once it's find, then I want to check that certain stuff, matches. So I want to say p.firstname.should equal this remote person.firstname. It's not the best of tests, but it's at least a smoke test kind of check. And so how can I get there with DRB? So let's see if we can set up some sort of finder thing first. So one thing that works with finders is they always have to have an ID. ActiveRecord likes IDs. There's a gotcha with IDs in DRB, and I'll show you this. So if I go back in here, and I hook up my DRB object just like so. Okay, so now I should have that remote string available. There we go. So what about .id? .id is actually defined, and it is this object ID. You guys have probably seen this warning. If you try to sometimes in Rails, if you call .id on something, and the thing that you're calling it on happens to be nil rather than an active record model object, you get this warning. The ID is an old style Ruby concept that each object has an ID, which is some sort of memory. It's unique. It's a memory mapping of some sort. What I'd like to do is I'd like to use this actually if the other thing on the other side was an active record object. So here, if instead of me being in IRB, if I was now in script console on the server, so if I'm talking on the server, and I would like to say p equals person.first. Now I want to hook up this person to the remote server. Then we get a little step closer to be able to look up stuff from the remote side. So what I would say is drb.start service one more time. druby localhost 9000, comma, p. Whoa, something blew up. Oh, typo up here. This is the part of the screen I can't really see well. And let's connect this one again. Now this is the remote person. Now I have remote person dot first name. That kind of works. So I can talk to an ActiveRecord object, kind of, except the ID gets in the way. If I want to find the ID in the database is 1, but here I get this weird, large number, which is this old object ID. So what I need to do is I need to find a way to proxy the ID through also. Do you guys know, by the way, how these methods come to be? Like, how does it know there's a first name method on there? Give you a little hint. If you try remote person.methods, that shows all the methods defined for this object, which is actually a pretty short list compared to some other ones. Starts here and goes to here, and it does not contain a first name or a last name or anything else. So how does the DRB mechanism know there's a first person? Method missing, yes, the classic Ruby way. So it captures the method missing and then passes that through to the remote side, runs it there, and returns the result. This is how all the methods are implemented. This is why there's no setup required, unlike some other things. Like if you guys worked with enterprise stuff like Corba or something, there's XML mania before you can do anything. So I want to hook into this process. I want to actually try to hijack the method missing. And in the interest of time, I'm just going to do it quickly here and show you what the result of it is. So on my spec, I want to be able to use some sort of remote service. And I'm going to show you. Well, let's put this code in here. So this is my remote person that I want to find. So first of all, I want to have some sort of system, a DRB factory, that, and I'll show you how this is implemented, that can get a remote port for a factory product. So I have some system that lets actually me generate a factory object on the remote side, and I get a port back for that. So I can connect this new object to a specific port. And then I connect this port to the object. Now I have something called DRB ActiveRecord here. What is that? DRB ActiveRecord is this. You're going to love this. It's a little trick. So I actually derive from the DRB object. Remember, the DRB object is a thing on the client side that talks to the remote server object. And I just override the ID method. You saw that when I call the ID method, it gives me that long number and the warning. But I can override it, right? I can redefine anything in Ruby. And I just call method missing with this. And the beauty of this is, it then thinks, oh, okay, this is a missing method. I should pass that through to the server and get back the actual object ID of the ActiveRecord object. And so, yes, question. So the question is, can I call send ID on this thing? It's going to be the local method that's defined. So .send something is the same as .something. So there's actually no difference. The method invocation in Ruby is the same as sending a message to it. So that wouldn't actually catch it, because that sending the ID will still invoke Ruby's own ID implement, which is the one I don't want. I want to intercept it. So basically what I'm telling it here, throw away your previous implementation. It's always the last one wins policy in Ruby. The last redefinition sticks. And so if I'm the last one to redefine the ID method, then I get to win and I get to do something with it. And in this case, I raise actually a method missing exception, which is caught by the DRB Ruby infrastructure. And then this is why I showed you earlier that the method missing is key to implement the remote methods. And if this thing catches a method missing, then it just thinks, oh, I have to pass it to the server and get back the result. And that's all it does. So I'm sorry I'm rushing a bit here. I want to complete this little bit before we go anywhere. And there's actually one piece I haven't shown you. This is the client-side implementation. So the first thing I want to do is I want to set up, this is the familiar piece, right? A DRB object that talks to the remote port. And there is an object factory on the other side. Now that object factory can do multiple things, because in my test environment, I don't always want to talk to a string, or I don't want to always talk to a specific ActiveRecord database. I want to talk to multiple different things. So I have to set up some sort of factory that lets me parameterize the thing that I want to talk to, which is what this does. So, and then the implementation of this is also pretty straightforward. Let's go to the server, which is here. So here I need a new file that does some sort of hookup for me. It needs to run a server, which I call DRB server. Oh. And first I only want to really do this. So first I only want to do this when the test environment runs. I'm going to run the remote server, but this piece I only want in the test case. Now I need DRB. And I need this thing. This is the start servers that will listen on port 9000, and it will instantiate this guy, ActiveRecord Instance Factory. My goal is to be able to remotely instantiate objects. So what does ActiveRecord Instance Factory look like? Well, it looks like this. Just doing copy and paste here now. So it's a class that has this method that I just called earlier. So I want to be able to say, okay, I want to produce a person, and I want to do it in a factory. So I have a factory here that creates the factory product. And then I want to start a new service, a new DRB Ruby server on a new port, yet to be determined. And I want that to be able to talk to the client side. So the idea is that for each new factory product, I have a separate server running on a separate port, and then I can talk to it from the client side through a separate variable. That's what this does. And this is kind of a port inflation here. So there is this get new port variable. Sorry, this get new port method that allocates new ports every time. We don't know if this is the best way of doing it. But basically, every time you make a new product, you get a new port. And there's going to come a time when you run out of ports. I don't know if this is the best way of doing it, but this seems to work. And if you have a limited number of products, then you can probably get away with it. And since this always dies, it's not production code. This is just test code. It runs and then it dies. It doesn't tie up resources in perpetuity. It's a temporary thing. And so I make the product in the factory, and then I start a new service. Let's see what the client does with it. So the client does this. The DRB factory calls this remote method. The factory is just a thing that receives these remote method calls. And the one I defined is this get port for a product. That will create the product and allocate a new remote port for it. And then the remote person is just DRB Active Ruby, Active Record, which is my derived class with the ID trick, talking to that new remote port that I just got over here. Put that down here. Now, if I have that, then I'm kind of done. So I have accomplished my mission of doing something remote, something that is factory made on the remote side. This is what this code will do. And now I can check, that the remote thing actually can be found, and that it should be the first name. Let's see if it runs, shall we? May not. Okay, we have some problems here. Spec helper. Up here, yeah. Not sure I'm trusting RubyMon on this one entirely. I'm going to run this one on the command line first. Oh, the other problem is, of course, we need the server running. So we need two things. One is we need the remote server running, and we need to have this DRB thing loaded. So this piece here, the DRB server that only should load in test case, that needs to be activated. It's currently not activated. Let's see what happens. On the client, let's say spec person models person spec. Okay, so we get connect error. That is because there's nobody listening on port 9000 right now. So let's make somebody listen on port 9000. Script server, and I want to run the script server in test mode, -e test, so that the factory objects I create actually get created in the test database, not in my development database. And now that had some sort of problem here. Address and use, right, okay, let's kill something else. Should probably run this on a different port also, but then I have to change my code again to have the ActiveResource object talk to a different URL. Okay, so I ran that, and now my test still doesn't pass. And the reason is that Rails does not automatically load the wrong file here. This library file, this is the server code here. This doesn't get loaded automatically, so I have to tell it to load this. And I can do that through an initialization step. And there's a little trick to it. Let's see what we did here. You have to do something in here, the test environment, test.rb. At the end of this, we have to put in something called config.afterInitialize. This is a hook that runs after all the initializations have run. And then I require my DRB server library file. And this is another couple hours of work. This is because of due to some sort of Rails threading issues in startup. I don't really understand it, but we read that somewhere, and we found that to be the working case. So now let's retry this again. So my server needs to be restarted. Hopefully now with that DRB piece running in test mode. And let's see how it goes. Okay. Uninitialized constant DRB ActiveRecord instance factory. That is somewhat better because at least we're talking to it. Something's still not loading properly. Let's see, DRB server line 9. So I'm getting a server error here, even though I'm on the client. So let's see, server line 9. DRB ActiveRecord instance factory, that is defined here. Oh, you know what? The factory is not there, and I'm not loading anything here, so I need to require, thank you, factory girl. This is what I was shooting for. Factory girl, and then I need to probably gem require this also. And I need to create the factory. Yes, thank you guys. New factories.rb. And then I need to actually require the factory also. Person do p dot first name Han p dot last name Solo. And lastly, we need to require the factory in here. Require, what I did here is file join, just to make sure we got the right path there. Spec factories. And I call it plural factories, right? Yes, okay. Okay. Let's see here. Server, restart, and spec. The server should have been migrated by now. Yeah. Oh, you're right. The test database doesn't exist. Good point. Rec db schema load. I've never run rake spec on this new server yet. Okay. Ah, all right. Thank you. Okay, I conclude the presentation. So obviously, it's a bit rough around the edges still. So if you have use for this or find this useful, I want to turn this into a gem. This is sort of a progress talk, and I was hoping, to get some feedback and ideas from it. And thanks for helping out, guys. The test objects, this could be refined a bit. The setup is too complicated. I would like to do a rake task that starts the server, stops the server. When you ideally you should just say rake spec remote or remote spec or something, and it does everything. We're not quite there yet, but work in progress. Thanks for that.